So hello everyone. My name is Matthew Norris. I'm a member of the Lackawanna Band in Northern Saskatchewan and Treaty 6. But I've had the privilege of living and working on the unceded ancestral territories of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh in the city of Vancouver. I wear a number of hats. On one end, I'm the president of the Urban Native Youth Association in Vancouver. On another, I'm a senior policy analyst with the BC Assembly of First Nations, coordinating their response to the United Nations Declarations Act. I also had the privilege of attending the UN Permanent Forum on a number of issues to talk about UNDRIP implementation. And I was a policy advisor to a Vancouver City Councillor and on the drafting committee of the UN Declaration work here in the city of Vancouver. So it's great to be there. Sorry I can't see everyone, but I'm happy to have this discussion with you all.
No, thank you so much. It's a really powerful that you have worn hats from both inside the systems and then from outside the system. So thank you so much for being here. And we can see you, so rest assured that you will definitely be heard. So thank you so much. Gabriel, would you please introduce yourself and share some of your work with us? Thank you.
Can I try just hello?
Yes.
Sego Garo Hondo Youngcats. Hello, my name is Gabriel Miracle. I am from, well, I was born and raised in Ottawa, Ontario, so I'm a local yokel. My father is from Tyne-Tenega Mohawk territory, which is the Simcoe deed or Treaty 3.5. I am also a policy analyst with the National Association of Friendship Centers, though I am not here in that capacity. And I'm also a PhD candidate at the Channy Wenjack School for Indigenous Studies at Trent University in Peterborough, Ontario. So I wear a couple of different hats, and I think that's it.
Thank you, Gabriel. Justin.
Hey, everyone. My name is Justin Campbell. I am the Director of Research and Strategic Partnerships with the Friendship Center in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. As part of that role, I manage and coordinate the First Voice Urban Indigenous Coalition, which is led by the First Light, the Friendship Center. I am not Indigenous myself. I'm a settler who enjoys the privilege of being able to organize for human and Indigenous rights on the island of Uktahumguk, now commonly known as Newfoundland. Yeah, I'm here to talk about UNDRIP. So that's it, short and sweet.
Excellent. Happy to have you all here. We have about 2 hours to have this conversation. And so for the first couple of hours, I want to make the good use of time that we have with Matthew in 30 minutes. But I'd also, in the second half, after the first hour, pose some of the questions that specifically pertain to NUIC and to coalitions. To have conversations in smaller groups, just in your tables, and then share that feedback actually in a larger group so that we can have a portion of the panel, and then we can have some opportunity to be able to just sit and think with each other and then perhaps have conversations and share what those thoughts are. So our first question that I have for our panel members, and perhaps Matthew, we can start with your thoughts. On the idea of much of the conversation about implementing UNDRIP in Canada has focused on natural resources, energy projects, and respecting the self-determination of on-reserve Indigenous people. What are the differences when it comes to applying the principles of UNDRIP to Indigenous people living in urban centers specifically?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what a fantastic question. I mean, that is the question, isn't it? I think there's a lot of opportunity here. Something that I was really excited about working on UNDRIP within the city of Vancouver is I'm starting, like the city of Vancouver, I mean, when we look at cities and their role in implementing Indigenous rights, you have to be fairly aware of the context that each city operates within. So within the city of Vancouver, we have 3 host nations, Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And then we have a very large urban Indigenous population. And so one of the big challenges and obstacles to implementing the UN Declaration is being aware of that context and being respectful of the kind of different experiences that host nations have had with the city versus the experience that the urban Indigenous communities have with the city. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples has, a number of very significant articles and calls to action within it that recognize the rights to self-determination, to self-government, to title, to free, prior, and informed consent, which have particular applications to the nations on whose territories we live. But it also has particular programmatic implications as well in terms of our right to housing, to culturally relevant institutions, to education, to clean water, and to a certain quality of life that also implies responsibilities to how the city interacts with the urban Indigenous community. I think this is a very important conversation to have because I don't think it's been had for a long time. I don't think we brought the urban Indigenous community together with host nations to talk about our relationships to each other. How do we exist in partnership and collaboration without infringing on each other's rights? And so this is an area of responsibilities that cities can take a significant role in kind of hosting these conversations and bringing together these communities to have discussions on how do we relate to each other and how do we govern so that the kind of programmatic rights-based interests of the urban Indigenous community is recognized but doesn't impede on the land-based interests and rights that the host nations have. So, I mean, maybe I'll leave it there, but I'm happy to talk more about that.
Well, it actually leads quite nicely into the next question. And we'll come back on the other two panel members on your thoughts of that. But the next question is what role are coalitions playing or could play or perhaps should play in advancing UNDRIP at the municipal level? Perhaps Matthew, if you just kind of wanted to continue with your previous thought about the role of municipalities and coalitions and those relationships that are intersecting at that level.
Sure. I think we're still at a fairly nascent phase of kind of under implementation and education broadly. The city, or I should back up a little bit and say, so the province of British Columbia was the first jurisdiction in Canada to begin to pass legislation and then work on an action plan. Canada is following that with the United Nations Declaration Act and the current engagement processes on the National Action Plan. And then the city of Vancouver was one of the first cities to go beyond just endorsing the UN Declaration, but actually to host, to co-develop and collaborate with host nations on what implementation actually means. So that's a foundational principle of the UN Declaration, is that any kind of actions to implement it or how to prioritize implementation of it has to be co-developed with Indigenous peoples. And so that's where I see these coalitions having a strong role at the tables to bring people together to co-develop this work with nations and with the city on how the action plan to implement the UN Declaration should look like. But there's also a lot of work on just education and advocacy. So I know outside of these kind of three examples, there's a few other cities out there doing work. I believe Squamish in BC is doing it. I believe Montreal has started to look at it, but there still needs to be a lot of advocacy from organizations and coalitions to really push for what we already know has been called for. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, I believe it was called action number 43, called on all levels of government to implement UN Declaration, but we aren't seeing that to date. And so a big role that we need to start pushing for is that advocacy to say, look, these other jurisdictions are doing it. We need all cities and municipalities across Canada to come to the plate on a similar action plan.
Thank you.
I could just chime in there quickly.
Yeah, please, Justin.
Matthew has referenced TRC 43 and how it calls on all levels of government to take action in this area in implementing UNDRIP. And I think one of the challenges here is that, especially when it comes to some extent, provinces, but especially municipalities, it's really not clear what that means. So that's one of the challenges that we face. And just a question I could throw back to Matthew is when you talk about advocacy, what does advocacy look like at the municipal level, considering that many cities, and speaking from the context here in St. John's, and Ray, I could talk more about the work that we're doing there. But I suspect outside of Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal, there's a similar kind of response from municipal governments and saying, hey, like this is a federal government responsibility to implement UNDRIP. So what might advocacy look like from your perspective, Matthew, in that kind of context or scenario?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one of my other hats was I ran as one of the Indigenous candidates running for city council in the last municipal election here in Vancouver, unsuccessfully. But I think what advocacy looks like is it's a lot of the issues facing the Indigenous communities, communities plural, host nations and urban Indigenous communities aren't at the forefront of municipal politics. And so getting coalitions out there to talk about the systemic inequities in how cities address housing, how cities, what municipal policing looks like and how it impacts the Indigenous community, what are educational systems and the impacts on the Indigenous community look like. There are a number of areas within municipal jurisdiction that fall that coincide with Indigenous rights as articulated within the UN Declaration. It's land use, it's housing, it's climate mitigation, it's homelessness, it's how we contract city services, it's how we recognize Indigenous culture and languages within our cities through naming and signage and so forth. So I think that's where I see advocacy is connecting these lines between municipal jurisdiction to Indigenous rights and to the discrimination our communities face within cities.
And it's a major shift away from the status quo, for sure. Gabriel, I'd like to invite you actually to respond or to share your thoughts actually on the two questions. Would you like me to repeat them or?
Sure, that'd be great.
Okay,
Thank
sure. So what are the differences when it comes to applying the principles of UNDRIP to Indigenous people living in urban centers specifically? And then what role do coalitions play or could play in advancing UNDRIP at the municipal level?
Well, the difference in application with respects to, I guess, in context I'm thinking of between reserved communities and urban cases is who's applying it. Indigenous peoples carry their rights with them wherever we go. We don't lose our inherent rights to self-determination, self-governance if we leave a community or if we were born in the city. With that being said, whether or not the federal government chooses to recognize those rights is really where the issue is. To my mind, the application of UNDRIP within the urban context is pretty straightforward because that document does not delineate differences between urban and reserve or urban and traditional territory peoples. We have those rights as Indigenous peoples. It's more of a question of whether or not the federal government or a provincial government or a municipal government is willing to engage with those rights. Provinces have been doing an absolutely bang-up job of ignoring urban Indigenous peoples for as long as there have been urban Indigenous peoples. And I think that's where that second question comes in, is where do coalitions come into ensuring that UNDRIP is applied within the context of municipalities? I think they are absolutely crucial to ensuring that UNDRIP is taken seriously as a piece of legislation that does apply to municipalities and does apply to the provinces. And I think part of that is through stakeholders and capacity building at a local level with coalitions, but also engaging with non-Indigenous organizations who support Indigenous rights and support Indigenous peoples, whether it's the Elizabeth Fry Society, the John Howard Society, whether it is education, whether it is training initiatives. There are plenty of non-Indigenous organizations that are supportive of this, and through collaborative processes that can pressure municipalities and ideally pressure provinces to take UNDRIP seriously and take it seriously within the context of dedicated Indigenous spaces.
And if I could just pick up on a thread that Gabriel mentioned, when it comes to the provinces doing, as you said, a bang-up job on respecting and recognizing the rights of urban specific Indigenous people. I think they look at the context of urban Indigenous people and say, look, it's way too complicated. The diversity of Indigenous peoples in urban centers means that we don't have any single point of contact necessarily to go to. There to do consultation or actual engagement using free, prior, and informed consent is the standard. So that's a layer of complexity that doesn't necessarily exist at the federal level, although you could make an argument that it's there as well. But thinking about the municipal context and the urban context in particular, and thinking about the powers and responsibilities that provinces have when it comes to municipalities being so-called creatures of the province, there's a clear role for provinces to play. And the question is, how do, from my perspective, how do coalitions, in particular, but urban Indigenous people more generally, organize themselves in a way that makes it easier for, or that puts pressure on provinces or creates avenues for provinces to respect and recognize those rights that are set out in the declaration. Is that, and thinking especially about some of the complications potentially in the declaration itself when it talks about representative institutions. This is a key part of FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent. So the question is, who is playing that role in the urban context? How can we make it a little bit less complicated so that there's more unity from within that diverse community in the urban centers, so that provinces basically have less excuses when it comes to recognizing rights that follow Indigenous people, no matter where they live.
Thanks, Justin. I know it was mentioned, I think, by Matthew, the relationship between host nations and urban Indigenous people. And I know that that's not the case across the country. I'm wondering if, Justin, maybe you might want to speak to that for a second.
Yeah, certainly not the case in St. John's, which is the traditional ancestral homelands of the Beothuk, whose culture has been destroyed forever as a result of colonization. So our context in St. John's is a little bit different. The city itself still exists on traditional unceded ancestral lands of the Mi'kmaq as well, but there are no host nations in or around or even very close to St. John's at all. The closest nation is Mi'kmaq First Nation, which is about 500 kilometers from the city. Now, members from all of the Indigenous groups and organizations and governments across the province live in St. John's. It's a very diverse and thriving and vibrant urban Indigenous community, but we don't, as considering that we work at the municipal level, it's less obvious why these other Indigenous organizations, First Nations that don't have a clear geographical stake in St. John's, why they should even be involved in a coalition like First Voice, which is advocating even for members of these Indigenous groups and organizations across the province. So that's an additional challenge that we face, besides the fact that, as has already been pointed out, there are no host nations within St. John's. So there's, again, that adds further layers of complexity. There's no single point of contact for either level of government to go to say, look, we're interested in proceeding with reconciliation, however you want to define that. We're willing to engage with you using FPIC as the standard of that engagement. So it's an extra layer of complexity for us, and I would imagine for other urban centers across the country as well.
If I may, I just want to pick up on that thread.
Certainly.
I think it's important to emphasize that UNDRIP's application within a municipality or within a reserve context really has to be specific to that particular community, because Justin's pointed out, there's a lot of complexity and difference between, say, St. John's and even Ottawa. Our host nation are the Algonquin, who are technically in another province, in Kitigan-Zibi and in Pikwakanagan, but that's two different provincial contexts that just overlap just the Ontario side of the province. And even to add layers of that, Ottawa is also home to the largest community of Inuit outside of their traditional territory. And that the Inuit have a completely different context and history with respects to colonization and with respects to their relationships with the government, whether First Nations people have nation-to-nation relations, while the Inuit have Inuit Crown relations. So when thinking about UNDRIP in the context of a municipality. It really has to be very, very municipal specific. A one size fits all approach doesn't work. That was one of the reasons why the federal government made a move to a distinctions-based approach to Indigenous issues, which, don't get me wrong, has a laundry list of problems associated with it, but it really does have to be context specific, which admittedly can make national movements or national coalitions difficult or more complex, but that doesn't mean that it can't be done. It just has to be done deliberately and with an eye for ensuring that Indigenous rights are upheld within the context of which the people that they come from.
Yeah, and just to pick up further on a thread there, again, going back to the diversity of Indigenous peoples living in urban centers. So I already mentioned the province's inclination, certainly in Newfoundland and Labrador, to say, okay, what are the official groups that we need to consult with or engage with if they're feeling like they're in a good mood that day, in order to advance questions around FPIC or other issues that are specifically identified in UNDRIP. And typically what they'll do is they'll go up to Labrador. And again, this is best case scenario from the province's perspective. They'll go to Labrador, they'll talk to the Inuit of Nunavut, the Inuit of Nunatsiavut, the Innu First Nation of Nitassinan, and on the island part of the province, they'll talk to Halibu First Nation, which is out on the west coast, but also some areas in central. They'll talk to Mi'kmaq First Nation, which is on the southern part of the province. They won't talk to urban Indigenous people because they'll say, look, we've already got our bases covered talking to these 5 other groups, on the assumption, totally erroneous, that the interests that may be expressed by those 5 Indigenous groups are the very same interests that urban Indigenous people have. And never mind either that the diversity of the urban Indigenous community in St. John's goes well beyond those 5 groups. So we have Indigenous people from right across the country living in the urban center of St. John's. So it goes back to the question or the point that Gabriel mentioned about rights under UNDRIP traveling with Indigenous people. If provinces in particular are not willing to engage with urban Indigenous people, then we're totally erasing the rights that members from Haida Nation, for example, may bring with them when they move from BC to St. John's and Newfoundland and Labrador. So again, it goes back to the diversity of identities and the way that rights are recognized or not recognized.
Thank you, Justin. I don't mean to cut you off, but just in the final minutes while we have Matthew, I'm wondering if you might be able to comment on the federal implementation of UNDRIP and what that might mean for a distinctions-based approach.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I agree in some sense with what we've been saying in this conversation. I think one thing I would push for, though, is to not have these conversations in isolation from each other. I think a productive way forward is to talk with nations and with their Indigenous community, which is a difficult task in of itself, but the lack of representational organizations and so forth. But because there's different ways that the implementation of UNDRIP could look. I mean, and it's important to have these conversations as a collective to ensure that we're not stepping on toes, that we're not infringing on title and rights in municipalities that do have host nations, and like there's different ways, there's different outcomes that could exist, and there's no handbook on how to do this. No city in the world has implemented the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, so there's no guidebook on what a final outcome could look like. It could look like urban Indigenous representative organizations having their own legal systems, accountability systems, and so forth. Or it could look like host nations taking on the role of providing the rights-based interest in their territories to the urban Indigenous community. Or it could look like host nations getting, for example, I think it's the Grand Council of the Crees has an urban Indigenous department where they take care of the rights of their citizens living in cities. So there's different outcomes and avenues, and I don't want to be too prescriptive without this conversation having happened yet, saying this is the one outcome that we're going to be pushing for. And so there are different possibilities. And I think that the conversation needs to be had because it's not being had currently at the level that it needs to. In terms of the question, in terms of what the UN Declaration Act is potential for, is this advocacy role. We're seeing these jurisdictions moving forward on national action plans. To my current understanding is that those conversations haven't reached the urban indigenous community yet, largely due to a lot of the concerns and issues that have been raised already. So now is a good time to start pushing for that within your cities. The last thing I want to say too, before I do have to go, unfortunately, is another role that coalitions can take on is the monitoring and accountability mechanisms. It's a significant aspect of UN declaration implementation is 1, action plan, 2, education, 3, monitoring and accountability. So if you need organizations out there actively looking over the shoulder of municipal governments, saying, are you reaching your goals? What is your action plan? Are these co-developed? Are we recognizing principles of free, prior, informed consent, and then publishing report cards or engaging with international mechanisms to hold municipalities, provincial governments, and the federal government to account on meeting their goals around implementing the UN Declaration. Really sorry I have to leave.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. I
Great
recognize that
conversation.
you read over your time. Thank you so much for joining us. Take care. Gabriel, I'm wondering if you have any additional thoughts on what UNDRIP implementation might have on a sanctions-based approach.
Well, if I'm going to be a cynic about it, I think unfortunately, it's going to depend on what the electoral landscape looks like over the next maybe 2 years. My sense of it is that UNDRIP, because the framework is going to be rolled out as of June 21st, I believe, of this summer. And as I've begun to notice that I received an email this morning from one of the parties doing a fundraising thing saying, oh, there's rumors that there's going to be an election this year. And I'm sorry to report that if that's news to you, but this might actually be happening. And if there is a change in government, the incoming government is going to have a different approach to reconciliation and a different approach to UNDRIP. So I can't say for sure what it's going to look like when it comes to addressing distinctions based approaches to UNDRIP, partially because I don't think any federal government or any political party would admit to failing or admit to breaking those agreements or to admit to breaking a law. It'll just be interpreted in a particular way that suits what they view reconciliation to be. And I think that is one of the big criticisms that has been with Bill C-15 is that the engagement is happening after the act has been made into law. That is one of the biggest criticisms that I've come across. And my main concern is that by abiding by not necessarily the spirit or intent, but just the letter of the law, it'll entrench those distinction-based approaches even more. And that will further marginalize urban indigenous peoples, because at the end of the day, the federal government and the basis of the Indian Act is to ensure that there are less Indians, not more. And that might be a bit cynical, but.
Well, I'm wondering if you wouldn't.
I totally agree with that. And it's too bad that Matthew had to drop off, because I did want to push back a little bit on this idea that all nations, or I'm not even sure that's really what he was suggesting, but that nations could, for example, create their own urban departments. He mentioned at least, or cited at least one example there, to look after the rights of members that move from one part of the province or the country to an urban center, maybe somewhere else. The problem with that is that it ignores the inherent indigenous rights that non-status members have. And this goes to the point about the Indian Act. And obviously the point of the Indian Act was to make sure that there are no indigenous people with recognized rights in this country. And so one way of doing that is by driving indigenous people off traditional and ancestral lands and into urban centers where those identities become erased. And with that, a perfect excuse for governments to fail to recognize those rights. So even though there is clearly a place for recognized nations to play when it comes to UNDRIP and to some extent other urban indigenous issues as well, I think by overlooking or pretending that urban indigenous people do not have distinct identities or distinct communities is a mistake, because it plays directly into the goals of the Indian Act in the first place.
And for the record, not to be a complete doomsayer, I will say that one of the key and probably one of the most unique things, particularly within the BC context, was the implementation of the UNDRIP Act made it so that the province of BC had the ability to negotiate and discuss with hereditary governments and hereditary chiefs. Now, that was also under the auspice of the Wet'suwet'en protest, so it's not like completely perfect, but this is a way to ensure that there is potential for UNDRIP at a federal level to be set up so that traditional hereditary governance bodies can be a part of these discussions, and that it's not just through band council governments, at least within the First Nations context. I just want to emphasize that as well.
Thank you. So the next question, moving on, we have is about representation. And so many coalitions and organizations, including NUIC, are hesitant to identify as representing urban Indigenous people. And UNDRIP rather explicitly ties many of the rights it describes to representing Indigenous organizations. How do we reconcile these two positions?
I'm going to let you take this.
Oh man, you're throwing me under the bus.
I have my own thoughts on it, but as a non-Indigenous person, I feel reluctant to share those thoughts, at least as a first speaker.
So did you want a moment to think about that, and we can move on to the next question and perhaps come back?
No, I think
Okay.
it is an important discussion to have, and maybe this might be me being kind of sneaky with it, but I think representatives is a fairly broad word, where if you have an education initiative that is based in the city of Windsor that is Indigenous based, they can be representing the Indigenous approaches to education within that city. I mean, I guess to my mind, representation and governance don't always have to mean the same thing, in the same way that there are plenty of friendship centers and executive directors of friendship centers who would be considered representatives of an urban community, even though they haven't been elected. And they make no claims to being, you know, the mayor of urban Indigenous people in Toronto or anything like that. I think these types of discussions are important, particularly when we're talking around governance and representation. But I do think it requires being very, very careful and very, very deliberate. I mean, I wouldn't claim to represent all of the urban Indigenous peoples in Ottawa, say if I was elected to city council, because I was born here, but my people aren't even originally from Canada. We're from upstate New York. And there's a number of Inuit people who would say, well, this person doesn't know my lived reality. And I think, again, that speaks to the complexity and the nuance that requires within an urban context. But I do think that there are avenues for representation, but from sticking within like the particular field of a program and a service delivery, not necessarily laying claim to speaking for all Indigenous peoples in the city of Winnipeg or Sudbury or something like that. It depends on the city, depends on the people.
That's exactly what makes it more complicated, though, and why there is less engagement with urban Indigenous people on these issues than there really should be. But let me step back and talk about the Friendship Center, because I often speak on behalf of the Friendship Center in St. John's, even though I'm not Indigenous myself. We do a lot of grassroots engagement, so I'm pretty familiar with the issues that are faced by the community. The Friendship Center movement originally started as a way of bringing together urban Indigenous people and providing services and supports to people living in urban centers and off reserve in particular. And speaking from First Light's perspective, so the Friendship Center in St. John's, we've been doing that for 40 years, but recognizing that many of the programs and services that we've developed are dealing with, in many ways, the symptoms of colonialism rather than directly challenging colonialist systems. So we've started developing a stronger policy and advocacy positions, including through the coalition that we've created, First Voice. I've got all kinds of documentations. We've got ambitious plans set out in this document that we just released. So we've started moving more in a policy and advocacy direction, trying to tackle head on the issues that we've been trying to work with through our programs and services. But all of this to say that the Friendship Center is increasingly playing more of almost what you would call a representative role. We've got an elected board of directors, which is majority Indigenous. And I can get away with this because you're not here wearing your Friendship Center hat today. The friendships, the NAFC in particular, and most Friendship Centers tend to shy away from taking the position of representing the community. Often will phrase things as advocating alongside the community. But at some point, some kind of organization, particularly thinking of a context like St. John's, some kind of an Indigenous-led organization is going to have to say, here are at least our thoughts on the issues facing the urban Indigenous community that we serve right here, whether that's St. John's or Ottawa or somewhere else, and actually trying to take the lead in that policy and advocacy position. So I think there's a gap there, and Friendship Centers, or at least coalitions that are led by Friendship Centers, should be reluctant to cede that ground if we want to see progress on UNDRIP or whatever other set of issues.
Thanks. I think it's important too, actually, when we're looking at the work that we're doing, Justin, as you mentioned, oftentimes we're looking at the symptoms of colonialism and creating initiatives to address them, which is really looking at downstream solutions to an upstream problem. Are there any models that we can draw from other jurisdictions to help inform UNDRIP implementations in cities, provinces across Canada?
That would have been a good question for Matthew before he left.
Just thinking that.
Yeah.
Well,
He's
this is
the
a
expert
question
in that
actually that
area.
we're gonna pose to you folks, so you can start thinking about that. There's 3 questions that we're going to do some table group work, and that's one of them. So the next question then would be, how do you think that the principles of UNDRIP can or should shape Newark strategic direction in the next 3 to 5 years?
Well,
Thoughts on that?
I have ideas on that, but maybe I'll jump back to the previous question.
Oh, sure,
now
yeah,
that I've had a couple of
absolutely, of
seconds to think
course.
about it. I actually think, as maybe I was suggesting in my previous comments, that coalitions are probably well positioned to address those questions precisely because most of us use a very collaborative model. Most of us are very close to the grassroots and Indigenous led. So I think that is at the very least a starting point for creating a process that's grounded in free, prior, and informed consent that's set out in UNDRIP, and using that as the basis for, if not representing, then at least speaking to urban Indigenous issues.
Yeah, I think that is going to be the key, is having is that coalition approach, just because urban Indigenous peoples and urban Indigenous communities intersect with so many different institutions and so many different Indigenous-based institutions that it can't. I'm sure there are probably cities and towns where having one consolidated organization that is the representative body of the urban Indigenous community is out there, but in other instances, it has to be a bit more flexible. And I do think it is important that that at least within certain contexts, is that host nations have to be a part of those collaborations and those coalitions, because we are living and growing on their traditional territories. I mean, I always jokingly say that the Mohawks like claim to all of Canada because we're a bit expansionist, but realistically, it's important to be respectful of the people's like territories that we're on. And doing that type of engagement is going to be important, especially if, you know, the prospect of doing any sort of urban representative body within the context of Canada is a really, really new idea. And it's really, it's new, and nothing like this really has been implemented at a widespread scale. So like it would be completely understandable if there is hesitations between host nations or between among other representative bodies, like bodies that are part of AEFN or ITK or the MNC. And part of that is just through engagement and collaborating to emphasize that urban Indigenous issues are important to, you know, all Indigenous peoples, and then we all have a stake in ensuring that the urban spaces are flourishing.
So it comes back to the point of diversity then again, and the complexity that adds. So I'm just imagining if I'm a representative of the federal government sitting in this room listening to this conversation, and let's say I'm less sympathetic to some of the views that are being expressed here. I may be thinking, okay, this is a nightmare. How are we ever going to respect free, prior, and informed consent if Indigenous people can't even agree on what the priorities are, as though there's a single set of priorities that Indigenous people have? So if you're thinking from that perspective or trying to put yourself into that perspective, you perhaps then like it just seems like an overwhelming challenge to solve. Okay, now there's a million different groups we have to consult with or engage with in order to even begin making progress on any of these issues. So I don't really know how we solve that problem, because obviously Indigenous people do not have a single set of priorities or issues. Host nations will have different priorities and issues compared to our urban Indigenous people that live outside of those territories. Non-status Indigenous people will have different sets of priorities still. And then you've got just the diversity of groups within urban settings and various other organizations within those urban settings too. So it's quite diverse. It's very multi-layered. It's complex. And I think it's important for us to think about, I guess, getting head to your next question, but what can NUIC do here? How can we make that process easier for the federal government and other government partners to work with us as Indigenous organizations, as groups that have convening power, so that those rights ultimately can be respected, the ones that are set out in UNDRIP. So there is kind of a facilitating role that I see potentially for NUIC, certainly for coalitions, and definitely the coalition that we have in St. John's, and trying to smooth that process, simplify it a little bit, but with the goal not of erasing distinctions that different Indigenous groups and people may have when it comes to their priorities, interests, and values and perspectives, but precisely to try and advance that common floor of rights that's set out in UNDRIP.
Thank you. So I've got one final question. Oh, there's an online. Sorry, Eugene. I'm not sure what your, there's a question? Okay, perfect. In the Zoom, can we go to the Zoom if there's a question?
Do I have the power to do this?
Is that my, this is Karen Hunt. Is that my hand that's up?
It looks like it. Yes, Karen, go ahead.
Okay, just a couple of things is, I have recently been party to a number of different discussions regarding the urban Indigenous community. And at each of those tables, there were different organizations, national in some cases, purporting to represent urban Indigenous people, and some who stated certainly not represent, but to serve. And one of the key themes that keeps coming forward is, as we engage in these discussions, how do we do it from a perspective of decolonizing previous or past ways and means of engaging with our people. And we talked about what really needs to rise from the ashes is protocol and the acknowledgement of how necessary protocol is. And it's going to be distinctive across Canada. There aren't going to, the different provinces, for example, are not going to see it the same way. And I know when we looked at UNDRIP, the process that we engaged, one was that all of the Indigenous organizations came together and they did literature reviews and they developed papers, that they presented to the province. But then they also wanted an inclusionary process because they felt that that's often what is missing. Like a comment was made earlier that it became law before there was any kind of engagement, and now you're scurrying to do the engagement after the law. And so the process that we have engaged is to have community discussions with a wide variety of cohorts of our people, elders, youth, LGBTQ, the older worker, just looking at different cohorts within the community and bringing them together to provide a response, their response to UNDRIP. And we see that the more that we do that, we see that there's more that needs to be done, because our community members are as diverse as any. And so going forward with the entire UNDRIP, I could see how, from the first glance, it looks very complex. But if the urban community is able then to come together as a community and say, we need to hear the voices of our elders, we need to hear the voices of our youth. And above all, what we want to see rise from the ashes is the protocol, that how we acknowledge protocol, because that's really just plain old basic respect. And so, for example, I'm very honored to be able to work and serve our community in the unceded ancestral lands of the Lheidli. And that's kind of the thread that weaves throughout any of these discussions, is that they are the hosts, and if we show them or provide the proper respect and protocol going forward, that would be the kind of landscape that we're using as we're looking to build, or we're looking to restructure, or whatever it is that we need to do going forward. I'm really appreciating the two of you and your comments that you're making, and enjoying this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your comments. So one final question, perhaps. I'd like to take the opportunity to hear your thoughts on how the federal government has been engaging Indigenous people in the development of the action plan, and what perhaps they could be doing differently, and what they have done well.
I mean, they've done well in that they extended the deadline for submission, so that's good, right? That's definitely a positive. I think the fact that they are doing some form of engagements, period, is good. I know that sounds like that's a very bare minimum,
Well,
but
especially considering the FPIC standard, right? I think we need to do a little bit better than engagement, certainly better than consultation, because it's a little bit self-defeating to say, here's the action plan that we have for implementing UNDRIP, which is about cutting me off, which is about supporting the rights to free, prior, and informed consent. So obviously that has to be central to the process. I'm going to leave it for other people to comment on whether that has in fact been the case.
I think if I were to add one recommendation is that as far as I can tell, the reports and the engagement that are done by Indigenous organizations and communities are being sent to the federal government, to the Department of Justice, then yada, yada, yada. And now we have a framework. So I think having more transparency as to, you know, which reports are they writing or which reports are they reading? What's the sort of the ideas that they already have going into the reading and the crafting, because that, like, as far as I can tell, that entire process is behind a veil of secrecy, which is, you know, kind of par for the course for bureaucracy in general. Don't get me wrong, but it would be better to have a bit more transparency in the actual crafting of the framework, other than, you know, ta-da, here we go. What do you guys think? Great, cool. On to the next thing.
Yeah, and I do think that there is, I mean, you mentioned par for the course for bureaucracy, and I do think to some extent there, a lot of this is informed by cultural differences that aren't necessarily brought to the fore. For example, federal government, like any government or complex organization, saying, look, we have to get this done within a year. But the communities that we work with in St. John's take a much more collaborative process, and that process aims at building consensus, which often can't happen in a very short period of time, like a year or shorter than that. So I think there needs to be some understanding that there's cultural differences here, and hard deadlines like 1 year to come up with an action plan are not necessarily realistic, considering the audience that we're working with, considering the rights holders who need to be part of that process.
I think being conscious of those colonial constructs and constraints actually would be a significant improvement, actually.
Now, that
Raising that
makes
consciousness around
the
that.
job a lot harder, so I can appreciate that too. But we have to make a distinction here between what is the process we're using versus the end result. And in many ways, when it comes to UNDRIP or other urban Indigenous issues or Indigenous issues in general, the process is often the desired result. It's that people want to be heard. They want to see that their rights are being respected. And that isn't about just saying, look, we've got an action plan or we've got whatever policy outcome. It's about making sure that people feel that they've been heard and that they've been able to participate meaningfully in the process.
Yeah, I think that's an important point to be able to mention. Thank you so much. With the last hour that we have, I would like to do that group work and to hear back actually from Coalition. So we'd really like to have you participate. Before we do that, I'd like to thank Matthew in his absence for being a part of the panel, and also Gabriel and Justin for sharing your thoughts and really profound insights into this conversation that is big work and good work for us to move forward. So thank you so much for being here.